The Oracl3 Network.
Hi, welcome to The Jury Room, a true crime podcast. My name is Kevin, and I will be your host on this journey. We will be covering some of the most heinous, some of the most unthinkable, and some of the most monstrous crimes to ever be committed against humanity. We will be covering cannibalistic serial killers, decades-old unsolved mysteries, cold cases, missing person cases, and everything in between. The Jury Room podcast is available on most major podcasting platforms. Please make sure you go subscribe and leave a review.
Hey, Rainbow Warriors. This is my disclaimer. Beyond the Rainbow is a true crime podcast. It's not suitable for young children, and maybe not even for some adults. I tend to swear like a sailor, and I'm kind of proud of that. Listener discretion is advised. Hey there, Rainbow Warriors. Welcome to Beyond the Rainbow. True crimes of the LGBTQ+. I'm your host, CJ. Find me on the socials, Facebook and Instagram at Beyond the Rainbow, and just about everywhere else at Rainbow Crimes. Check out my website at beyondtherainbowpodcast.com. On the site, you can find links to missing but not forgotten LGBTQ+ people. And with that, please welcome my friend Jan, who is a Rainbow Warrior and the host of Wicked Crimes South Africa podcast. Jan will present this episode's Missing. Take it away, Jan.
Hey there, Rainbow Warriors. This episode's Missing but Not Forgotten LGBTQ+ person comes to us from Brooklyn, New York. Tyrell is the dead name of 16-year-old trans teen Mia Santiago. Mia went missing at 9:15 p.m. on August 20th, 2005. She was seen getting into a cab with an unidentified man on the 300 block of Rodney Street in Brooklyn. Mia was never seen again after that. Unfortunately, there is not a whole lot of information about the man Mia left with, and unidentified is the best description of a man anyone can give. There are no reports of this man's ethnicity, hair color, or even if he had any hair. Whoever was witness to this account should have been able to give more detail. And what about the taxi driver? Was he found? Was he interviewed? Police seem to have taken a very hands-off approach to this case from the beginning. Mia was a theatre school student at the time of her disappearance. If found alive today, she'd be nearly 33 years old. Mia is black, stands at 5'6", weighs 115 pounds, and wears feminine clothing. Many true crime enthusiasts believe Mia was a victim of the Long Island serial killer and was Asian John Doe, found on Gilgo Beach. Asian John Doe was found dressed in women's clothing, is 5'6", would have been of a slender build, was between 17 and 25 years old, and it's been determined Asian John Doe was murdered around when Mia disappeared. Slight problem. Mia is black, and Asian John Doe is, well, Asian. Some reports have said Asian John Doe isn't really Asian, which means until someone gets their shit together and actually does some DNA comparison between Mia and Asian John Doe, this theory remains exactly that, a theory. Should the mention of Mia's case have jogged anyone's memory, please call New York Police Department at area code 212-694-7781. Back to you, CJ.
Thank you, Jan. Warriors, I have a case for you that is an entire shit show of drama, false accusations, false confessions, and murder. The train wreck of terror took place in Tel Aviv, Israel's second most populous city. Let's see if we can chip away at the events and try to make some sense of it. The year the crime happened was one of the worst years of my life, 2009. During this year, the home I owned went into default. The bank put up notices, and I was forced to leave and declare bankruptcy. But what was even much worse that happened that year? My mom died of pancreatic cancer. The next 12 months of my life after that were pretty surreal, and I really just went through the motions of living, existing really. Somewhere in those next 12 months, my daughter's baby mama left and I had to get my shit together. So I certainly don't remember this horrific crime occurring in Israel at all. It's been compared to a smaller scale Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting. I'm not really sure why. There are far too many differences to compare it. The only real comparisons I see is that they were both mass shootings on what should have been LGBTQ plus safe grounds, and both had some link to the Middle East. Aside from that, I don't see the similarities. Tel Aviv is known for its LGBTQ plus tolerance. Notice I didn't say acceptance. Israel is okay with same-sex marriages as long as the actual marriage act happens somewhere else abroad. Once you go elsewhere to have the ceremony, they'll honor your marriage. And just recently, last year I believe it was, Israel put into play giving same-sex marriages the same benefits as heterosexual marriages. I must say, for the Middle East, that's pretty damn progressive. On Saturday, August 1st, 2009, just over 12 years ago, the LGBTQ plus community center called Bar Noar was located in the Aguda building. The center happened to be having a social for its LGBTQ plus youth members that night. Now this facility sounds like it's a recreational type area. On this particular night, LGBTQ plus kids under 18 had gathered for conversation, food, music, and games. Of course, there were to be several adult counselors that work for the community center, and they were there to chaperone the event. Bar Noar isn't a very big space. It's probably as big as 2 or 3 standard-sized living rooms, with a small balcony and no fire escape. There's only one door in and one door out of this community center, and I'm approximating roughly 30 to 40 people were there that night between the kids and the chaperones. Around 11 p.m., at least one gunman entered the Aguda building. They made their way to Bar Noar. The gunman was dressed in heavy, all-black clothing. He was wearing a ski mask. The gunman carried a pistol and possibly another firearm. He then opened fire into the Bar Noar facility. The young attendees dove for cover behind a sofa, under a bed, under tables, behind a pool table. After spraying bullets about the room, the gunman escaped from the facility on foot. In the aftermath of the shooting, 2 people lay dead and 11 people injured. The dead were a 26-year-old counselor of the facility, Nur Katz. Nur was a computer science student, and he left behind a 27-year-old German boyfriend. Nur was the kind of guy who always wore a smile. He had great respect and love for every living being. The other deceased victim was a 16-year-old straight girl named Liz Trebuchet. Liz was at the center in support of some of her gay and bisexual friends. She was a happy girl and she loved writing poetry. If someone wrote on a forum that they had just came out, Liz would be one of the first to congratulate them for living their truth. One of Liz's friends also at Bar Noar was 14-year-old Jonathan Books. When the mass shooter entered the center, Liz was facing the front door. Jonathan had his back to the door and he asked Liz if she was ready to leave. That was the moment Jonathan heard the loud boom of gunshots. He froze in place as the searing burn of being struck with a bullet went through his shoulder. The gunman stepped back out of the doorway, possibly to load a new magazine into his pistol. He then stepped back in and started shooting again. Jonathan, still frozen where he stood, is then shot in his spine and lung. He collapses and he crawls under a table. He's terrified the gunman will come back and finish him off. After many more bullet blasts wreak havoc in the center, the gunman leaves. Jonathan remembers being fully conscious when he's taken to the hospital. He'd lost a lot of blood. 2 CAT scans were given to him before he went into surgery. Jonathan was given very narrow odds of surviving. 2 weeks later, he was released from intensive care. At the hospital, every surgery is filmed for documentation. Jonathan's spinal surgery video somehow has vanished. Jonathan's paralyzed from the waist down. He'll never be able to walk again. This leaves Jonathan to believe that some type of fuckery must have occurred during his surgery for the film to have disappeared. Jonathan's been through hell and back since this nightmare of August 1st, 2009. He lost one of his best friends. He lost use of his legs, and he's forever wheelchair-bound. Jonathan even lost the support of the LGBTQ plus community because Jonathan sued Bar Noar. He was told,
"How dare you spit in the well you drink from? It's too bad you survived it all."
Sadly, when the community turned their back on Jonathan, he grew a hatred for the community he once loved. At the age of 14, Jonathan felt so very alone in his struggles to heal emotionally and physically. After a couple of years of self-pity, Jonathan decided to finish school and he began studying interior and graphic design. He bought himself a car that was modified for his disability, and he bought himself an apartment. Jonathan's love of dancing and dreams of being a model had to fall to the wayside. 7 years after the shooting, at the age of 21, Jonathan was having a hard time with his love life. It seemed the guys he wanted to date wanted only able-bodied sex machines. And the girls, they also seemed to judge him by his disabilities. It's been 5 years since Jonathan had made this interview. He'd be 26 now. Jonathan, if you're out there listening, I sure hope life is better for you, especially in the love department. And I hope that the LGBTQ plus community and you have made amends. Let's get back to the mass shooting. Police were called and immediately took to the streets looking for a gunman or gunmen. Hundreds of officers went door to door questioning residents in the area. Roadblocks were put in place to try to stop the gunmen from fleeing outside Tel Aviv. There was a problem, though. They had no fucking clue who they were looking for. No one was arrested. 4 years later, an informant came forward with information about the mass shooting at Bar Noar in 2009. The informant named a 23-year-old man who would have been 19 at the time of the shooting. His name, Haggai Felician. And let me tell you, if you were to be a crime judgy and judge a person by how they looked, you'd see Haggai and his beady eyes and thick unibrow and say, "Yep, that fool's a killer." But we have to base things on evidence and facts provided to us, even if unibrows should be considered a criminal act. The motive for the then 19-year-old Haggai to slip in and shoot the LGBTQ plus center was because allegedly the center's founder, an LGBTQ plus advocate named Shaul Gannon, had molested Haggai's 15-year-old male cousin. The end result would be Haggai, his 15-year-old male cousin who was now 19, another accomplice named Tarlin Hankshiev, and the center's founder, Shaul Gannon, all were arrested for the mass shooting attack. By the way, Shaul sports a unibrow also. Maybe it was fashionable in 2009 to have your eyebrows intersect into one. It worked for Frida Kahlo, I guess. After 4 years of nothing, police were very excited to have all of this fall into their laps. Their informant was apparently another man who was in on the plan to attack the founder, Shaul Gannon. The informant just happened to be incarcerated for another crime, but he told officials he'd tell them all about Haggai's murder plan and the mass shooting if they would only lower the sentence he was currently serving. So a deal was made. Revenge seemed to be the motive behind the mass shooting, with the wrong people falling victims and losing their lives. Eventually, Shaul said he did have sex with the 15-year-old, but he didn't know he was underage at the time. The 15-year-old said Shaul never assaulted and raped him. It's weird how no one can seem to get their story right. So in June of 2013, 3 of them were released. The once 15-year-old who was supposedly molested, the founder of the center, Shaul Gannon, and the supposed accomplice, Tarlin. None of them were incarcerated anymore. But in order for Shaul to be released, he had to agree to testify in court against Haggai. The following month, Haggai was the only suspect still being indicted for the mass shooting. The indictment stated that Haggai confessed to an undercover cop he did the mass shooting, and he did it because of a biblical edict to attack homosexuals. While Haggai was still incarcerated and awaiting his trial, his brother Yaakov was arrested. He was arrested for raping a female attorney that applied to be on Haggai's defense team. Yaakov claimed that she was lying only because she was not chosen to be part of the team. Yaakov submitted to a polygraph, and he passed. So the police were satisfied with that and released him from custody. At Haggai's trial, he was found not guilty of being the mass shooter. The informant was found not to be credible, nor was the undercover cop he supposedly confessed to. Haggai was set free. This seemed to be just another case of this crime being cold so long. When the informant came forward, the police got so excited they couldn't contain themselves. This investigation turned out to be one of the most expensive police investigations Israel has ever had. After the mass shooting, many rallies and protests calling for justice took place. Politicians and lawmakers condemned the shooter, and they promised to help keep their LGBTQ plus people safe. But it's been 12 years since the night of that terrible tragedy, and the shooter or shooters have never been captured. Will there ever be justice for Bar Noar? We don't know for sure. This episode's Quickie crime comes to us from the state of Indiana in the year 1983. The man gunned his motorcycle loudly down the street, piquing the interest of some nearby teenage boys who longingly watched the motorcycle vibrate down the tar-paved road. It must be a thrill to feel all that horsepower under you, to feel the power of being able to command a machine like that, and to feel freedom once you start riding. The boys watched, dreaming of a life like that, until the man on the hog was just a speck in the sunset. Saturday, June 18, 1983. The two friends, 16-year-old Eric Fuller and 15-year-old Jeff Lopez, decided to take a local camping trip. Packing up their gear, they set out on an 8-mile trip from their home in Kingsford Heights, Indiana, to the Kingsbury Fish and Wildlife Park. Once they set up their campsite, they grabbed their axe and they started to scout for firewood. As the boys walked along the railroad tracks looking for dry wood, they came across a man who introduced himself as Frank Davis. 30-year-old Frank was sitting on the tracks smoking a joint. He offered a hit from the joint to the boys, and the boys both indulged. They had a small conversation for a while, talked about marijuana plants and how to grow them, and then the boys continued their search for the wood. They told Frank where their campsite was, and they invited him to come hang out with them later in the evening. Frank ended up joining the boys. He pulled up into their camp on his motorcycle. The boys were enamored with Frank's motorcycle. Frank good-naturedly let the boys take turns riding his bike. One of the boys accidentally got the motorcycle stuck in the mud, and Frank calmly helped him pull it out of the mud. Dark was starting to fall. The boys and Frank drank some beer and smoked some weed by the fire they had built. Finally, Frank told the boys it was nice meeting him, but he had to move on. The boys were sad to see their new fun friend go, but they were starting to get sleepy. They sat by the fire for a while, and then Eric went into the tent and fell asleep. Jeff sat on the picnic table for a bit, but soon he crawled into his sleeping bag outside the tent and fell asleep. When Frank left the boys, he drove his motorcycle a short ways up the dirt road away from the boys' campsite. There he left his motorcycle, and by foot he made his way back to where the boys were camping. He laid where the trees were dense and there was a lot of brush. He stayed there watching for hours, until he was pretty sure the boys were asleep. Frank approached Jeff, who was sleeping outside the tent. He held a knife to his throat and he told him not to wake Eric, or he'd kill them both. Frank then led Jeff away from the campsite, grabbing the boy's axe as they went into the woods. Feeling like they were out of earshot of the campsite and any other campers that might be around, Frank made Jeff stop. He bound his hands and feet with wire. Then he lowered Jeff's pants and he sodomized him. Frank then forced Jeff to perform oral sex on him. Once Frank felt sexually gratified, he knew he couldn't keep Jeff around. It was a liability. So he laid Jeff out face down, and he brought the axe down so hard on Jeff's neck, he nearly decapitated him. After he was done with Jeff, Frank kissed Jeff firmly on his lips, and he crept back to the campsite to deal with Eric. Frank woke Eric and he pulled him out of the tent. He stripped him and bound him. Then he sodomized him and forced Eric to perform oral sex on him, just as he had forced Jeff to minutes earlier. When Frank was finished with Eric, he took a large rock and he slammed it into Eric's head several times. He also hit him with the axe several times, and he left this boy to die too. Frank exited the boys' campsite and he went to retrieve his motorcycle. The following evening was Sunday. Both boys had been reported missing by their families. Very close to this same time, a woman living between the campsite and the neighborhood that the boys lived in, she was out mowing her yard. She called police to report she found a dead teenage boy. Police came out to investigate. The boy's body was immediately taken to the medical examiner. The boy had a wire binding his hands and feet. The wire was also tied around his neck. The boy had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. It was determined he had been murdered on Thursday night, June 16th, 2 days before Jeff and Eric's camping trip. The dead boy in the medical examiner's office was 14-year-old Darren Reed. Monday came. Utility workers found a teenage boy who was crawling around some bushes. The boy was in bad shape. An ambulance was called and he was rushed to the hospital. Once at the hospital, the boy was hydrated. His wounds were dressed. He was being treated for a concussion. Doctors found his peripheral vision was fucked up, and the boy was having seizures. But the boy was gonna be okay. That boy was Eric. He gave law enforcement officers details and a description of the man who had done this to him. Tuesday morning, Jeff was found. He did not make it out alive as his friend Eric had. That same Tuesday, police would pick up Frank Davis as a suspect. Eric immediately identified Frank as his attacker. It seems in January of 1983, 6 months before Derek, Jeff, and Eric were attacked, there was another boy in LaPorte, Indiana, who was attacked. He was a 15-year-old boy called J.S. in court documents. J.S. had just left a store in LaPorte where he was playing video games. It was about 5 p.m. and it was starting to get dark for that time of year. J.S. was walking home through a cornfield, and he noticed somebody following him. Just then, the man disappeared. The man ran ahead of J.S. and grabbed him at the end of the cornfield. The man held a gun to J.S., and the man knew J.S.'s name. He knew where he lived, and he knew J.S.'s sister's name. The man even knew J.S.'s girlfriend. As the man started to walk J.S. into the woods, J.S. asked the man how he knew all that information. The man said, "I just do." The man then tied a wire around J.S.'s neck, and he held the other end. This allowed the man to tighten the wire if J.S. wasn't cooperating. The man pulled down J.S.'s pants, and he started to perform oral sex on J.S. While he was doing this, he pulled the wire around J.S.'s neck tight. This caused J.S. to pass out. When J.S. became conscious again, the man forced him to another part of the woods. He forced J.S. to lay on his stomach. J.S. pleaded with the man not to kill him. The man took his gun out, and he beat J.S. unconscious with the butt of the gun. This time when J.S. regained consciousness, he saw that the man was gone. So he got up and he stumbled to the police station where he filed a report. Because of all the similarities with the wire and such, LaPorte, Indiana got wind of Frank Davis's capture. And it seems all of Frank's attacks and murders in 1983 could have been prevented had Frank remained in prison. You see, Frank was paroled at the end of 1982. J.S.'s attack happened January of 1983. Frank had been serving time for some burglaries he made back in the early 70s. Frank is actually suspected of raping and murdering a teen boy in 1971. Frank pleaded guilty to murdering Derek and Jeff, and to sexually raping and assaulting Jeff, Eric, J.S., and Derek. He was tried and found guilty and sentenced to the death penalty. Frank said he wouldn't appeal his sentence. He said his victims would all feel better if he were dead. I wouldn't confuse that with remorse, however, because Frank changed his mind and he appealed. In 1993, the death sentence was taken off the table, and Frank was resentenced to 220 years. Frank should never be able to be a free man, thankfully. Love you, Rainbow Warriors. Remember, it's not a crime to be gay, unless you're a murderer.